Hey there, welcome back to another episode of DIGGSVILLE, the podcast. I am your host, Scott Fraser, and it's good to have you here. This episode, we talked to comic book artist Nicola Scott. Nicola was visiting Melbourne a couple of weeks ago from her hometown of Sydney for a comic convention, so I was able to catch up with her. She's a really good example of someone who's working within a very specific creative industry. And what's interesting about her story, she works in comics similar to Christian Reed, who we spoke with earlier. But with Christian, I think his main goal was to tell his stories, and kind of where that fell was inconsequential. Like, I think for Christian, the main point was for him to get his stories out. Was Nicola, and you'll hear this, was very specific about what she wanted to do and the place that she wanted to be working in within the comics industry. And she got there. And listening to this episode, you'll find out just how hard that was and how dedicated she was to getting there. It's an inspirational story. It's a very fun story. And it was a good talk. It was a really long talk, and the longest one I've recorded thus far. So likewise, I'm splitting it up into 2 episodes. So you'll get the grand finale next week. Alrighty, so let's get into it. Here we go. And I'm here with Nicola Scott, comic artist.
Hi.
Now, for those people at home who might not know much about the comics industry, can we just kind of talk about who you work for and how that kind of works? So you are on contract?
Yes, I am. I work for a company called DC Comics, which is one of the big American superhero companies. There are 2 sort of major American superhero companies. There's DC and Marvel.
And Marvel are like Spider-Man, X-Men, Hulk, and DC are Batman, Wonder Woman,
Superman,
Aquaman.
Yeah, they're sort of all the old school, iconic guys, and Marvel's all the sort of new school, cool dudes.
And you've been with them for a while?
I've been with DC Comics for 7 years now.
And you've been working across a couple of different titles.
Yeah, I've been... my first gig there I was on for just over 2 years, and I've been on sort of different titles kind of once a year since then. And the book that I'm on at the moment, I've been on for a year, and I'll probably be on for the next couple of years.
Okay, and so you are essentially a permanent casual.
Yes, I'm a contracted freelancer, I think is the deal. I'm still referred to as freelance, but I am under contract to that company where I work exclusively for them, and they guarantee me the work.
Okay, and so we'll probably get into this a bit in more detail later. So, but you have to do X amount of books a year?
The contract just recently changed. The company structure has been shifting over the last couple of years, and the contract used to be that I had to guarantee them 6 issues a year, and they had to guarantee me 6 issues a year. Now, the nature of the contract has changed in that there isn't there isn't a sort of set number of issues that I have to deliver or they have to guarantee. It's more...
But if you don't do a book, you don't get paid?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I get paid by the quantity. Yeah, essentially the way they work out our pay is a page rate. That's how you negotiate. And most books at DC Comics are 20 pages at the moment. There are a few that are... a bit more, but most of them are 20 pages at the moment. So even though you negotiate under a page rate, it tends to work out, a certain set amount per month.
Yep. And you're kind of a big deal, aren't you?
Oh, if you say so.
You are successful.
I have been really fucking lucky. There are a finite number of these particular kind of jobs with these big companies where they pay you to produce the work, this sort of work for hire conditions where you're working on great characters, for really well-known companies, and you get good royalty schemes. Certainly DC has a great royalty scheme. There's only as many jobs available as they have books, and they have 52 books a year, so there's 52 of those jobs, and out of the whole world I got one.
Yeah.
So I do feel like I'm really, really lucky, because at the moment, despite there being fans all over the world, I'm the only person in Australia that's got a monthly book at one of the big companies. I've been the only person for a long time that's had a monthly book at one of the big companies. And out of those people that have one of these jobs, I'm one of the few of them that has an exclusive contract.
Yeah. So I think that's, not to blow smoke up you, but that's important in the context of where you started and how you got there and what you're doing now.
Yeah, when I think about it, I know luck has had to play into it, because when I very first started, I had made the decision to draw comic books.
So can we go back to them?
Sure.
I've heard you tell your origin story before.
You?
Yeah, are you bored of it? Or?
No, not at all. I love telling it, because I still can't believe it.
Yeah. So go back.
Go back to the very beginning.
You were working in restaurants.
I was working in restaurants. I was an actor, so therefore I was working in restaurants. All of my training had been as an actor, and that was the career I'd been pursuing since my mid-teens. And for a whole lot of reasons, it just never really took off in a way that was satisfying. But when I hit 25, I suddenly got a lot of advertising gigs. At 25, you're allowed to advertise alcohol. I got quite a few advertising gigs in
as a model actress.
Well, yeah, it was kind of like as an actor, but really when you're doing advertising, particularly things like alcohol, it's really just modelling with the occasional line or whatever.
So why do you have to be 25? So you look
I don't know.
So you don't look 17 or 18?
Yeah, it's the rule. I don't know. Like I looked 28 when I was 18, so that was one of the things that always played against me in sort of getting roles, that I looked older than roles that I was the right age for.
Yeah.
The things that I was the right age for, I didn't have the experience for. And when I hit 25, I was allowed to do alcohol advertising, so I had to advertise every fucking alcohol under the sun. But, advertising isn't acting. It's not, it wasn't satisfying, and it just wasn't going anywhere. Anyway, long story short, I had decided to put that career in a box indefinitely and find something else creative to pursue. And so I sort of looked at the talents and skills that I had at my disposal, and sewing and drawing were the things that I could come up with, and it was really a process of elimination, trying to sort of think of ways to make money out of either of these options and trying to guess how satisfying they would be to do.
So, to what extent were your drawing skills and I guess your sewing skills? Like what? Had you had training?
They were pretty good, actually, because my mother was an artist and my grandmother was an artist. So the culture of art was always in my family as I was growing up. And my mum taught myself and my sisters sort of, all the basics with art, but it stuck with me quite a bit more than I think it did with my sisters. My elder sister is a graphic designer, so she certainly absorbed quite a bit of information from mum, and my middle sister is a musician. So the sort of the creative energies were sort of encouraged in all of us, but when it came to mum's particular skill sets, they kind of occurred in me as well. I sort of had a good knack for drawing, and she would go off to life drawing classes when I was a kid, and she'd take me along because I was little, and instead of giving me a toy to play with in the corner, she'd give me a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper and say, draw the model.
Yep.
So at 5 I was doing life drawing classes.
Yep.
just incidentally.
Okay, yep. As opposed to, I guess, most comic artists where they'd be reading comics in the corner, drawing. You were out there kind of doing drawing.
I was sort of learning perspective and stuff when I was young from my mum, and I didn't really know about comic books until I was quite a bit older. I was sort of in my late teens when I really sort of started investigating comic books in any way. Seriously at all, even though I'd sort of seen a few of them at news agencies, I'd pick them up, but they were unfamiliar to me. I had a love of superheroes when I was a kid, and that was inspired by the TV shows and the films that were around. The Richard Donner Superman films really hold a special place in my heart, and the Wonder Woman TV series with Linda Carter, that was a big deal for me. She was the very first superhero I ever saw when I was 4. And I remember that day. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is for me. And I've never quite grown out of that superhero fascination. But when I'd see Wonder Woman or Superman or Batman, on the cover of a comic book in a news agency, I'd pick it up out of curiosity, but the continuity in the comic books was so different from the TV shows and the films that it kind of left me a bit lost. In the comic books at the time, Superman was a news reporter, and Wonder Woman had some job that it was so different from the TV show, and in my naivety I just thought, oh, these comic book people, they've got it wrong, they don't know what they're doing. I didn't know that, I didn't understand that it was the source material, and that the TV shows and the films had developed in their own way.
Yep.
But it sort of I found comic books sort of a little bit impenetrable, even though there were characters that I recognised. There were too many characters that I didn't recognise.
It's like trying to jump into a soap opera.
Yeah, you really have to commit to the immersion for it to really sink in. But on first glance, it would be completely overwhelming, and so I just sort of didn't really get into them until I was quite a bit older. And even then, I'd sort of only sort of, I'd go into a comic book store occasionally, and I felt very out of place. So I didn't spend much time there, and I didn't know what to buy, and I would buy the characters that I knew, and I could tell that I was just not in the know.
Yeah.
And so it never sort of really cemented itself as a career option to me. I never really considered it in any sort of serious way. It was just, I liked drawing, I loved superheroes, I always drew superheroes, and there were these books with lots of drawings of superheroes, but not that it hadn't occurred to me, because it had occurred to me, but it had never really cemented itself as an actual career option.
Well, I was talking to, when I was talking to Christian Reed, we were saying the same thing. Growing up, like, we've read comics, but we just did not think that you could get a job doing it, because it just seemed like something
so far away.
Yeah, so far away.
Yeah,
like not of our country.
Well, I think that was the really interesting step for me, because I was 29 when I made this decision. Apropos of putting acting in a box, knowing that as much fun as working in restaurants was, that it wasn't what I wanted to be doing when I was 40. It was like, I've got to find something creative to do. And rolling through the options of sewing and drawing, and I made my best friend's wedding dress, and so I thought, I could make bridal dresses, and then I thought, no, I hate brides. Brides are awful. I don't want to be doing that, and I don't want to. Nothing was sort of really exciting me in the options that I could think of without doing much research.
So, sorry, that was your incentive, artistic satisfaction, rather than getting like a job?
Well, it was, I wanted to do something creative. I felt kind of like I was missing an opportunity by not doing something creative and staying in restaurants.
Yeah, I guess you had a job.
Yeah, I had a job, and I was doing very well. I'd been headhunted to this sort of great job that was going to give me a clothing allowance and a gym membership. It was ridiculous. But I kind of knew that it was ridiculous and not really the scene that I wanted to be in, even though I felt like I could do a good job. I just thought, this isn't what I want to do. I really wanted to work from home or work in an art studio, and I wanted to do something creative. I felt like I owed it to myself and owed it to my mum and to, you know, the talents that she had sort of really drawn out of me. So in this sort of process of trying to eliminate things that I didn't think would be good, I had got it down to drawing, and I can remember this day. It was a Sunday. It was sort of late in the morning, and I was just sitting there thinking, if I had to draw the same thing all day, every day, because that's what a job is, what do I want to draw? What would I be happy drawing? And I just thought, God, I wish I could just draw Wonder Woman every day. It was this totally just incidental thought. But as soon as I thought it, I was like, oh my God, that is actually a job. That is a real job that exists. There is somebody in the world right now that is getting paid for that job. I want that job. That's working in comic books. Oh my God, I should be fucking working in comic books. And as soon as I thought it was just so clear and so obvious, and I felt so stupid for not having really thought of it seriously before.
And at that stage, had you thought about what that means? Like
no.
Sequential art? Is
absolutely not. I had no idea what that meant.
Yeah, because doing comics, sequential art, it's a lot different than illustration.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had no idea what that meant. I just thought, someone right now is getting paid to draw Wonder Woman. I just want to draw Wonder Woman. That's all I want to do, so I'm going to learn what that means.
Okay. So you're a girl in Sydney.
Yeah. And I as soon as I thought it was so clear, I jumped in my car, I drove to a comic book store. I went rummaging through all the books that were on the shelves, picking up every character that I knew, every art, you know, every piece of art that looked interesting to me, that I related to, or
how did you know where to go for a comic shop?
Because I'd sort of been peripherally aware. Yep. I knew that there was one in Bondi Junction which was close to my parents' place, so I had incidentally passed this place. It had been sort of on my radar, but I hadn't gone in, and I just thought, I'm going there. And so I went there and I bought $150 worth of comics. And as it turned out, the guy that I made the purchase with, who was working at the store, was Doug Holgate, who's now a great friend of mine and a very successful commercial illustrator.
It's funny how many times Doug gets name dropped in these podcasts.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Go, Doug. Yeah, well, he was my first touchstone, and as it turned out, he told me 2 years later, that was his first day, and I was his first paying customer, which I thought was brilliant. And yeah, he was there in training, and the guy that was training him up was just like, you just made a $150 sale from some girl who's just come in and bought a whole lot of comics.
See, I wonder what would have happened if you went to some other comic shop and had, you know, your cliche, surly, geek, angry nerd guy behind the counter.
I don't know that it would have stopped me, because as having been into comic book stores before and felt sort of intimidated by them, I think the intensity of this clarity and this certainty just gave me this propulsion that I hadn't expected. It wasn't there 20 minutes beforehand, and suddenly it was there, and it was so certain that that was my career of choice, and I was just going to make it happen. There was just no doubt that was what was going to happen, and it had come out of nowhere. And so I spent the first kind of 6 months not really knowing what I was doing at all.
What were you doing? Were you reading comics?
No, I started buying comics really regularly. I was going into that particular store every day because it was close to my parents' place. I could kind of go in there incidentally. And I started chatting to Doug behind the counter. And eventually I got up the nerve to say, look, I want to do this. I want to draw comic books. Do you know anyone that does this? And he was like, well, I kind of do this. And I was like, oh my God, that was amazing to me. It was a revelation. I was like, how do you do this? And he was like, well, I just sort of write my own stories and I illustrate them and I sell them at conventions. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he was like, well, there's a convention coming up in I think it was in like 2 weeks at the time. It was perfect timing.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, why don't you come along? Do you have a portfolio? And I said, yes. Even though I didn't really have a portfolio, I'd been sort of doing paintings for a while because, you know, one of the people that sort of had really hit me when I started buying all of this stuff in bulk once a week was Alex Ross, you know,
Yep.
because I had been painting for a while. I hadn't really been drawing for a long time, but I've been painting. And so I had sort of spent the last 6 months sort of painting pictures of Wonder Woman, thinking, you know, there are people that do painted covers for comic books. Maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe that's what I should be doing. That's what I had kind of been doing, just sort of painting pictures. And so he said, come along and bring your portfolio. And so I went to this convention and there he was behind a desk. And he was like, oh, here you are. And I said, yes. And he said, show me your book. And so I showed him my book. And he flipped through and he was like, oh, right, I see. You know, you kind of know what you're doing. You know, you're painting pictures of Wonder Woman. This is great. And he introduced me to Christian Reed and he introduced me to the publishers at Phosphorescent, which
Yep.
was...
Ben Howard.
yeah,
Yep.
it was this, you know, only publisher that was around at the time.
Yeah.
And I got a job that day doing covers for Christian's book, The Watch. And
which
that
I,
was
which I co-created.
that
with
you
him.
co-created with
Yeah.
him. That's right. And that was one of the buzziest days I've ever had. I came home from that show.
So that happened that day with Ben.
That happened that day with Ben. And I came home from that show just absolutely jazzed. I'd met Christian, I'd met Ben, I'd sort of chatted with Doug. I'd shown my work to people outside of my family and friends for the
Yeah.
very first time ever.
Yeah.
And that was a big milestone for me. And I was so energized by that experience. But I also came away from that day knowing that that was the only publisher in Australia
Yep.
and that possibly the only job available. I just got it.
Yep. And I don't know.
And that was kind of it. That was
Yeah.
like the pool.
And did the penny drop then? That I don't know if they talked about pay, and there might not have been money.
I can't remember if I'm sure I got paid something. Probably
Yeah.
wasn't very much.
Yeah.
But I kind of wasn't really motivated by the money at that point. I was sort of more motivated by the direction,
Yeah,
by the
starting.
idea, by starting off. But I did come away from that experience going, well, that was it. I just got the one job that I might get in this country. And so the more, you know, I started chatting to Ben. I sort of, you know, had a meeting with him and I sort of ended up having sort of relatively regular meetings with him, and Christian would be there and Karen would be there, Karen, Ben's wife, who was sort of working on the books at the time as well. And I got to meet you and I got to chat more with Doug and I got to know that everybody knew each other, and there was this small little posse of people that I felt like were my starting platform. And I felt like I'd sort of found this sort of new group of people that spoke the language that I wanted to learn.
Yep.
And it was sort of through you guys that I learned that if I wanted to make a living out of it, there weren't any options in Australia and I had to go to the States. And it was kind of delivered to me in that it's too far away kind of tone. You know, it was like, it's in America, you know, kind of forget it, it's in America.
Well, I think that's what we're all thinking and realising at that stage too.
Right.
Like, we'd all tried to do comics within Australia,
But
and
it
it wasn't
wasn't
working,
happening.
and then we were realising, well, we're going to have to go over there.
Yeah. Well, I sort of hit that like a train
Yeah.
with this, energy and momentum. And yeah, I heard that as you're going to have to go to America. And I was like, right, I'm going to America. Who's coming with me? And we went. We went to that first Comic-Con in 2002.
Yeah.
Yourself and Christian Reed.
Yeah.
And I. And
What was I doing there?
I don't know, but you came.
I think I kind of half went with a sample of a book that Christian and I were working
That's
on.
right, that's
But,
right.
Yeah, but it was also a good excuse for a holiday.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think at that stage I was serious about it.
Oh, I was serious.
Yeah.
I was going there fully motivated.
It was fun to watch too.
It was really?
Yeah.
It was kind of funny because I still didn't know what I was doing. I put together a portfolio.
So we should say that San Diego Comic-Con, it's supposedly where you go to pick up American comic work.
Well, it was at the time. It's a
Yeah.
little difficult now. It's a bit more of a mega show.
Yep.
Like at the time, I can remember our first day there being completely overwhelmed by how big it was.
15,000 people or something. I remember that
Oh,
week.
then? No, it
Yeah.
would have been a lot more than that. Yeah, I think it was... At the time, I can remember...
30,000?
No, it was more. It was
Wow.
more. It was a lot
Wow.
more. Because now it's like 150,000
Jesus.
people. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But at
And
the time, it was...
It's in summer.
I think it was about 75,000 people.
Wow. And 75,000 nerds in
Yeah.
summer all massed together.
Yeah.
Just sweating desperation and excitement.
It was really full on. I can
Yeah.
remember that experience and being really kind of intimidated by it because I went there with this, ridiculous portfolio full of rubbish because I didn't know what I was doing. I still didn't know.
So what was your game plan?
I didn't really have one because
Yeah.
I was so naive that I didn't have a real idea. My plan was to meet the Wonder Woman editor and impress him and get a job.
Yep.
And I was pretty sure that wasn't going to happen, but I was going to push it in that direction anyway. And it took me, it's a 4.5 day show, and it took me until the very last day to actually get the nerve up to say, okay, I've just got to bite the bullet and start showing my portfolio to people because I'd just been too scared.
Yep.
It was too overwhelming. There were too many people walking around with portfolios that were American and boys and serious geeks because
Yeah.
I wasn't really a geek and I didn't really know what I was doing, and some of them looked like they knew what they were doing.
So to put this again in perspective, like easily hundreds, almost 1,000.
I would say easily, having been there, every year since, I got very familiar with what the portfolio deal is.
Yep.
I reckon there's a good 1,000 people there every year with a portfolio.
Every year trying to get your job.
Absolutely. But one of the things that I learned, which came with the experience of going every year, is that of that 1,000 people, I reckon about 5% of them actually have a professional portfolio. There are a lot of people there that, like me on my first year, they have no idea what they're doing.
Yep.
And
So, okay, so then how did you make the next step? Did you make contacts? You got feedback?
well, I got the kind of feedback that you expect from a portfolio review when your portfolio is very clearly, thoroughly lacking and you have no idea what you're doing. It was very very polite, but at the same time, it was in no way encouraging. It was just like, yes, this is very nice. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yep.
And while I know a lot of people who, their first time at getting portfolio reviewed, and that's kind of the extent of it, they flip through everything and there might be one thing in there that they'll say, okay, I kind of get this. This makes sense to me. Do more of that.
Yep.
Or no, this doesn't make any sense to me. I literally, my portfolio was ridiculous.
Yep. Did you get constructive feedback?
Not very much. it was just very clear that I didn't know what I was doing, but I came away from that experience going, right, now I feel like I do know what I should be doing.
Okay. And what not to do.
Yeah, effectively, I felt like, right, I have to come back next year because now I know what to do. Because the first year I had no idea. And so I came back from that experience, again, really energized, but with a sense of direction now. And I still hadn't quite settled on the idea of doing sequentials, the interiors. I still didn't quite know. But I feel like sometime in the 6 months after that, I felt like, okay, no, sequential seems to be where the work is. You know, and the whole thing is about pursuing where the work is. That's why I went to America. That's why I'm intent in pursuing the American industry, because that's where the work is. I want to get paid to do this. So if that's where it is and that's where the money is in sequentials, then I'm going to give up on doing the painting. I'm going to give up on doing the cover art. And I'm going to learn what it means to do sequentials. And so I started doing sort of little portfolio pieces from little scripts that Christian had written, or that sort of Doug had suggested to me, you know, just sort of little whatever little sample scripts I could find, I started doing sequentials. And Doug gave me Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics.
Yep.
That was like a birthday gift or something, or a Christmas gift, I think, that he gave me. That was a complete revelation. It suddenly gave me the rules. It gave me the rules. It explained why the rules are there. It explained what I just wasn't understanding from observing and what I thought was replicating.
And Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, it's like a textbook on the theory of comics, how they work. Yeah. But it's all done in comic.
It's all done in comics. Yeah. It's sort
brilliant.
of the art and the techniques of sequential storytelling, using sequential storytelling. So it's demonstrating everything to you as it educates you. And I just found that book a revelation. And I read it over and over again. And each time I read it, I absorbed the next layer of information out of it. And I had such a steep learning curve in the 6 months after having that book that led up to me going back to San Diego. And I went back that year with the idea of staying in the States and living there for as long as I could. And I ended up living there for a year and a half. And I went to my second convention, my second San Diego.
So when did you move over there?
2003, the year after.
For San Diego?
No, I was there a few months before San Diego. The idea was to go there early.
In New York?
Do some networking. Yeah, I was living in New York. Do some networking so that when I got to San Diego, I had some contacts already established. And that worked for me. I met Jimmy Palmiotti through a mutual friend, and he was great. He sort of took me under his wing for a day and went through my portfolio and helped me sort of tighten it up and clean some things up, and, you know, taught me a little bit more that I hadn't quite learned yet, because I was still, you know, at these very early stages. The sequential pages that I had in my portfolio were still very early sequential pages for me.
So what were you doing over there for work? How did you get there in terms of visa?
Oh, illegal shenanigans.
Oh, you and Christian both.
Yeah. Well, I was hopping between London and New York, living in a hostel, just trying to do everything I could to spend as much time in New York as possible. Like, I have a British passport, so I could live in London.
Yep.
But sort of getting over to New York and spending as much time as I could there at any given stage.
Working, or would you be cashed up?
No, I wasn't working. No, I wasn't cashed up. I was living out of a suitcase. I was living off little money. You know, my roommate, my sidekick Sarah, she had a restaurant job. He's actually sitting in the room having a giggle and a glass of wine. She had a good nighttime job, and she would feed me in the middle of the night when I'd be working. You know, just sort of sitting at my desk drawing. She'd come home after working in a restaurant and take me out for a sandwich and a cup of coffee. and you know, I was living very, very hand to mouth. But you know, I had arrived there reasonably cashed up, and that got me through, you know, my first stint in New York. But I came away from that second San Diego with a job from a small comics publisher, and they didn't have very much money to pay me, but they contracted me for an issue of a book. And that was the first time that I was really drawing a proper sequential anything. And I got paid for it. And it wasn't very much, but it was enough.
Yeah.
And I spent the next year while I was overseas, the next year and a half, just sort of really working as much as possible, because by this stage I was 30 and I knew I was competing with people who were a decade younger than me, who wanted it as much as I did, who knew more geek stuff than I did. So I was sort of really needing to jump in the deep end and paddle really fast.
But do you think you've obviously got good social skills?
That helped, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, look,
you could act like an adult, a professional.
Yeah, like I think it was very clear to a lot of people early on that I had no idea what I was doing. But I was humoured because I was a girl, you know, there was a little bit of, you know, tolerance for my presence when I clearly had no idea what I was talking about. But I think also because I was demonstrating determination and I was getting work, and with each job I think I was getting better. And I think it was sort of slowly but surely it was occurring to some of the bigwigs that I was getting to know over the first few years that I wasn't getting discouraged, that I was actually continuing to pursue aggressively. You know, and I came, my third San Diego, I got a really big job drawing Star Wars comics for Dark Horse, and that was a big deal for me. That was like big pay for a big company working on Star Wars.
Yeah.
You know, that was huge. And you know, I still continued to do a number of jobs for free. There was, you know, an online comic called Halloween Man that I had built up a great relationship with Drew Edwards, who was the writer and creator of that series. And I continued to sort of do whatever work I could with him. Whenever I had free time, I'd sort of do short stories here and there. And that I'd do for free just because it was fun and it was keeping me busy. And I really just sort of spent that first couple of years just wanting to stay as busy as possible, while, you know, taking any paid work that came along. That would obviously take the priority. But in between,
Paid
it was
illustration work or work.
I was trying to avoid general illustration work. I really wanted it to just be comic book work because that was what I was focusing on. You know, I was really narrowing down on superhero work.
Yep.
That was what I wanted,
Yep.
because that was kind of what I got into it for. You know, I don't, as much as I love sci-fi and as much as I love horror, I don't really have the same emotional affinity for it as I feel like I have for superheroes.
So, and during that time, you were also working in restaurants or hotels and stuff. So you would prefer to work in hospitality and draw superhero comics without pay rather than doing like commercial illustration, like drawing that wasn't superheroes?
It didn't matter if it wasn't superheroes, it just had to be comics.
Okay.
I was quite specific because I didn't want to find myself finding a career building in a different direction.
Even
you know,
though you could have,
well,
presumably.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah.
If I'd allowed the options to happen, it might have happened.
So,
you know, that might have been the direction that my career took.
So it wasn't like drawing's drawing, I'm drawing. You
No,
specifically
I was really specific about it. You know, I had really narrowed in on DC Comics just because they own the characters that I knew.
Yep.
And, you know, the longer I was hanging around the comic book industry, the more I was learning, because the more I was reading, the more I was becoming aware of the characters at Marvel. Also at the time, this is, you know, when Marvel was going through a bit of a boom period themselves, and they're on the brink of their whole film franchise, which sort of kicked in after I was working at DC.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was getting to know enough people that were working for these companies that I was getting sort of, you know, the inside scoops. And I didn't want to be distracted. You know, I'm sure I could have accepted work in various illustration fields, but I didn't want to. Finding work is a part-time job in itself, and I wanted to get to that point where I didn't have to find it. I just have a job. I just wanted to be able to do the work, and the only way I could see that as a possibility was having one of these regular jobs at one of the big companies, the companies that are big enough to employ people full-time. And I think because of the intensity of that initial light bulb moment of deciding that I wanted to draw Wonder Woman comics, I was so fixated on that being what I was going to do that nothing else was going to get in the way. So I was kind of saying no to anything that wasn't comics. Which until I was working at DC meant I was drawing anything but superheroes, because all the other companies draw that, you know, they don't work in superheroes. You know, it's very, very difficult for any non-DC or Marvel companies to have successful superhero books. There are a few around, but they're few and far between. Mostly the other companies deal with horror and sci-fi and slice of life.
But are there kind of secure paid jobs in those other genres and companies?
Not really.
Yeah.
Most of them, like in the couple of years leading up to me working at DC, I was getting pretty regular gigs from IDW and Image and Dark Horse, and it was all for like 1 or 2 issues, doing, you know, a variety of things. Some of them were licensed products like Star Wars, or I drew a few Angel comics. Angel is in Buffy and Angel.
Yep.
But then I'd also sort of be doing creator-owned stuff for writers at Image. And that sort of seemed to be relatively regular. You know, I'd got to that point where the snowball had built up its own momentum and work was finding me.
Or was it that your skills were getting better?
Both. I think because I continued to go back to the States every year, my network connection.
Yep.
And I don't consider myself a natural networker. I can do it, but it's not a natural state for me. I was getting better at it, and my network was getting better.
Internet was...
and the internet really helps.
Yeah.
In fact, that was actually, I think, what tipped me over the edge, because I was part of a creative forum that was very buzzy quite early on. When I first went to the States, I was a member of a website that had a pretty buzzy happening creative forum, and I found a lot of fellow artists and some great writers that I got to work with and sort of encourage my way up the ladder. And through that, there was one guy that had become familiar with my work, this Canadian chap called Brian LaBelle, who used to say to me, "You should post your Wonder Woman pages on Jeff Johns' website." And I had gone on to the Comicbook, which was Jeff Johns' website at the moment. I don't even know if it's still going. Probably is. And there was an art forum, but it was kind of more of a fan forum rather than a creators forum. And so I didn't really feel like it was the right place for me to be posting art as at the time, semi-professional. So I kind of avoided doing that kind of thing. But he would remind me about it every now and then. And eventually I just sort of thought, okay, look, I'll post some Wonder Woman pictures there, but I'll introduce myself first as a sort of semi-pro artist. And I did that, and I posted maybe half a dozen Wonder Woman pictures, some sequential, some pin-up. And that thread took off, and a whole lot of professional writers, like Greg Rucka, who was the writer of Wonder Woman at the time,
Yep.
he discovered me there. Gail Simone, who I ended up working with at DC a lot, she discovered me there. Mark Andreyko is a great friend of mine. He discovered me there, and this thread took off. And out of that, Wizard magazine, which was still going at the time, they contacted me to do an interview on me, and labelled me as a talent to watch, which was sort of a big deal. And because of that thread, Gail and Greg in particular started campaigning with their editors for me to work with them.
On Wonder Woman and
On
what was Gail working on?
Birds of
Something.
Prey.
Yeah, wow.
And through that Wizard article, I got invited to a convention in Canada as a guest where they were doing a Women in Comics symposium.
And what were you in Sydney or New York?
I was in Sydney.
Yep, but bouncing.
Yeah, I was only going over once a year.
Okay.
But so I got to go to this convention in Canada where I actually got to meet Gail and I got to meet Greg, and it was very sort of it was very sort of that sort of early superficial meeting. Oh, hello, I've seen your artwork online.
Yeah.
It's very nice. And having some sort of chats where I feel like I made a nice connection with both of them, and they both continued to campaign on my behalf to get me on their books. And a few months later, I was at San Diego, and I'd just been to New York the week before the San Diego show, and I went into the DC office. And I met with the Wonder Woman editor, who was very familiar with me because Greg had been sort of hassling. And he was like, it's very nice, but you're a little bit green.
And that's where we're going to leave it for this week. Oh my god, cliffhanger. Does Nicola ever get to draw Wonder Woman? Well, yeah, I guess you can figure that out. She does. Check in next week anyway, where we'll hear the rest of Nicola's origin story. And then we're going to get into some pretty interesting technique, work processes, how she handles working for an international company from her home studio in Sydney. And she also drops another DIGGSVILLE exclusive. So please come back and tune in for next week. As always, you can find me on Twitter. So the DIGGSVILLE account is DIGGSVILLE and my personal Twitter account is Fraseville, FRASEVILLE. And you can find my website at www.sdfraser.com. Okay, that's about it. Good night. See you next time. Keep it comics!